Many recent books advocating atheism have made the bestseller lists. I've enjoyed reading many of these books, including The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, Breaking the Spell, Religion as a Natural Phenomenon by Daniel Dennett, The End of Faith by Sam Harris, God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, and God, the Failed Hypothesis by Victor Stegner. So I was intrigued when I saw that Dinesh D'Souza had written a book attempting to defend Christianity against my favorite authors. Instead of talking past each other, a believer in the biblical God and non-believers were in a real dialogue. I was not disappointed, though as you'll see, I disagree with much of what D'Souza writes in What is So Great About Christianity. D'Souza has understood and digested the recent spate of atheist books well enough that his summary of the arguments of the atheists persuaded me all over again to doubt the existence of God. So he is fair in representing the arguments of his opposition. Now, as an aside, let me say real dialogue and real attempts to understand those who think differently are especially important as we go into yet another presidential election season. In the heat of political competition, many of us will be tempted to recoil in disgust from the sincerely held political views of some of our acquaintances. I hope that instead we can try to understand and appreciate the things these people care about that lead them to support one candidate or another. Although we may disagree on political choices, I think it is usually possible to understand and even learn from the concerns that lead people to a particular choice. In the debate over God, there are many voices that are less temperate than D'Souza. Every time I saw Ann Coulter's book, Godless, on a bookstore display, back when there were still physical bookstores, I had to laugh because she uses the word godless as if it's a bad thing. She attacks liberalism by calling it a godless religion. But I have another sermon arguing that godless religion is exactly what we need, so that those who don't believe in God can also get the benefits of religion. I think people don't necessarily need God, but they do need religion. I feel we need to constantly improve, however, godless religion and agnostic religion beyond the current level. If godless religion and agnostic religion are to be fully competitive in the religious marketplace, they must have deep theology and a profound power to propel people to goodness, build strong religious communities, and provide experiences of transcendence. Because Unitarian Universalism combines a respect for its religious heritage with a firm commitment to freedom of thought, I believe there's a better chance of creating an agnostic religion that lives up to this standard within Unitarian Universalism than anywhere else. But I do not think that we are yet up to that standard, not up to the standard the world needs us to reach for the sake of future history. Today I'm going to talk first about theology and science, and then about precious things. Propelling people to goodness, building strong religious communities, and providing experiences of transcendence fall under the heading of precious things at the end. Since theology is Greek for words about God, it might seem strange to talk about the need for a deeper theology for godless religion. But I think it is important for those in a godless religion to talk about God. Let me explain why. Let me start with Pascal's wager, which Dinesh D'Souza thinks is a good reason to believe in God. Blaise Pascal was a 17th century French mathematician and philosopher who did some of the early work on probability theory that's the foundation of statistics. He argued that one should bet on the existence of God because if there is a God, believing in God makes the difference between heaven and hell, while if there is no God, it's not so bad to be wrong. One may have wasted some time and money on a false belief in God, but nothing approaching the danger of hell and the prospect of heaven on the other side of the ledger. When I was a Mormon, before I went too far toward unbelief, I considered carefully whether God would punish me for not believing in him. I decided that despite my imperfections, I wouldn't punish one of my children harshly for not believing in me. Therefore, a perfect, loving Father in heaven would not punish me if, doing my very best to figure things out, I came to doubt that he existed. Deciding that God, if he existed, would not punish me for my honest beliefs was and is a key ingredient to my being an atheist. And I still believe that. If there's a God, he's not going to be too unhappy with me for that. Maybe for some other things, but not for that. In general, even aside from Pascal's wager, deciding whether or not to believe in God depends heavily on what one thinks God would be like if he did exist. This is one reason I can see that thoughtful atheists still need to think about God. Later, I'll talk about other reasons thoughtful atheists need to think about God, even if God doesn't exist. The definition of God is often squishy. I remember vividly attending a Reformed Judaism Yom Kippur service as a college student just to see what it would be like. The rabbi said, "Many people think they don't believe in God, but God is just the idea of goodness, so they believe in God without realizing it. By that standard, I'm certainly a believer in God." At the other extreme, there are enough details in the Bible about the biblical God for me to feel quite confident that the God described in the Bible, taken literally, does not exist. One of the biggest gaps in the arguments for the existence of God given by people like D'Souza is the leap from the existence of some superbeing, which the arguments have some force for, to the existence of the specific God described in the Bible. For example, invoking Kant and Hume on the limits of knowledge, D'Souza argues that we can't really know there isn't a God, so why not believe? Let me run with this argument, and even lean in the direction of the existence of a superbeing, and I can easily get to a totally reasonable place that D'Souza would not be happy with because the superbeing is not the God of the Bible. There are at least two ways in which the standard scientific worldview is consistent with the possibility of a superbeing. These possibilities are both common themes in hard science fiction. You can guess how I know this. I'm an avid science fiction reader. These possibilities are very interesting, I think. Hard science fiction is science fiction that focuses on things that are genuinely possible given what science we know. One of these hard science fiction themes is reminiscent of traditional Christian theology, while the other is reminiscent of Mormon theology. Traditional Christian theology, put into a hard science fiction straitjacket, is like the idea that we're all software programs inside a superbeing's computer. There's no way to know this is not true. If it is true, miracles would just be a special case in the programming. The normal laws of nature could be as simple and regular as they are, simply because that was easier than programming more complex laws for the default case. Mormon theology, put into a hard science fiction straitjacket, is reminiscent of the idea that we are watched over by benevolent aliens from an advanced civilization. That's an idea I explore more in my Easter post this year. It was called, What If Jesus Was Really Resurrected? Musings of an Agnostic. And again, in the story I make up there, Jesus was resurrected, but again, Dinesh D'Souza wouldn't be that happy with it. So you can see that if you want. If you think of this idea of benevolent aliens from an advanced civilization, this is not only plausible, it's even possible to argue that it's likely. There are a lot of stars in the galaxy, but even at a fraction of the speed of light, it would take only a small fraction of the time since the Big Bang to get from one end of the galaxy to another. And there are even chunks of ice that can be nice way stations along the way. If these aliens like to settle chunks of ice in the middle of interstellar space, they can do it quite gradually. If evolution favors intelligence, why couldn't intelligent life arise several times in our galaxy? If any intelligent life has arisen before us, chances are it arose many, many millions of years before us, simply because it's been billions of years since the Big Bang. So it is not a big stretch to have aliens from an advanced civilization reach Earth. The big question is Fermi's question. Fermi was a famous nuclear scientist. Fermi said, where are they? if they're these advanced aliens? If they're here, why are they hiding themselves from us? And of course, there's the other big question of whether they're benevolent or not. I mean, if they're on the benevolent side, one thing we know is that they don't seem to have destroyed us, which is something. To me, these are important religious questions, but science fiction is not always recognized for the serious theological speculation that it often is. A truly open-minded search for God would consider as many possibilities like this as possible, but instead, the focus is usually the much narrower one of whether certain ancient religious texts are true or not. Looked at without preconceptions and without regard to which will get you laughed at in polite company, which is harder to believe, the possibilities laid out in hard science fiction or the God of the Bible. By all means, let's be open-minded about whether God exists or not, but not just about the God of the Bible. Let me leave aside for now the possibility that there are super beings that are relevant to our choices of what to do. Indeed, if there are powerful super beings in existence who are aware of us, one of the simplest reasons for them to be hidden is that they want us to act as if they don't exist. If so, it would be the will of the gods that we be atheists, or at least agnostic in relation to them. In the absence of God, our Creator would be the laws of physics and the principle of evolution. Dinesh D'Souza argues that the Big Bang is evidence for God. In saying this, I think his science is a bit outdated. In order to explain why distant galaxies are so uniformly distributed across the sky, cosmologists rely on the theory of cosmic inflation, in which a small patch of false vacuum can grow to a region trillions of light years across in a tiny fraction of a second. One of our sons said when he was young, "I know what's faster than the speed of light, the speed of dark." Turns out he was right. Within space, it's impossible to travel faster than light, as far as we know, but space itself can expand much, much faster when in the form of such a false vacuum. This kind of a patch of false vacuum in this theory, which is a fairly standard theory now, keeps growing, but islands within decay into matter and energy in what we locally call the Big Bang. Once the Big Bang is embedded in this larger picture of cosmic inflation, the universe is big enough that almost anything that can happen will happen somewhere. But one must be careful to remember that the universe is vastly bigger than the tiny piece that we can see with our telescopes. Almost everywhere in the universe is so far away that light has not yet had a chance to reach us from there yet. Given the vastness of the universe, it is almost a certainty that life would arise somewhere, even if the beginning of life is a very improbable event on any given planet. To his credit, D'Souza accepts evolution, but he underestimates it. Contrary to what he argues, it is straightforward to explain the evolution of morality. For at least 1 million years, our ancestors have been choosing who they want to hang out with, ally with, and have children with. Those who were trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent, are often chosen as allies and mates, helping these traits to survive and prosper in the population. My friend Randy Nesse has worked out some of the details of this story of the origin of morality. Darwin began his argument for evolution by pointing out the power of the selective breeding that farmers use to domesticate animals. Randy pointed out that in many ways, human beings seem more like domesticated animals than like wild animals, and with good reason. We have been domesticated by the choices of other proto-human beings that made and what the choices they made about whether to hang out with our ancestors. The key difference between evolution as our creator and the God of the Bible is that with evolution, the best comes at the end, not at the beginning. And by the way, that's teleotheism. The word telos, the teleo is about the end, God at the end, rather than God at the beginning. So with evolution, there was no Garden of Eden, only primordial soup in a warm pond, but heaven is still possible. We and our descendants just need to build it. The first task is to decide what we want. And actually, that's kind of what I spend my work days trying to do in economics, trying to figure out what people want. That's an important topic in economics, but I think it's a deep one theologically as well. So how do we figure out what we want? The medieval theologian Anselm defined God as that than which no greater can be thought, and proceeded to argue that God must exist since something that exists is greater than something that doesn't exist. Therefore, the greatest of all things the greatest of all things must exist. Therefore, God must exist. That was his argument. Now, it's my understanding that modern philosophers reject Anselm's argument on the basis that existence is not an ordinary attribute, like being massive or being photosynthetic. Existence has a special status in logic. So let me do a riff on Anselm by defining God as the greatest of all things that can come true. The greatest of all things that can come true. God is the heaven, or in Mormon terms, the Zion, the ideal society that we and our descendants can build. And God is a reasonable description of the kind of people who make up that society. But what does a heavenly society look like? Let's start with the easier question of what an ideal human being looks like. Here I look to Jesus, not the historical Jesus, but the imagined Jesus, who is the projection of every good human trait as valued by our culture. It makes all the sense in the world to ask, what would Jesus do, even if one believes that the historical Jesus was only a man, since what would Jesus do is a good shorthand for what our culture thinks a good person would do. This is an example of the way in which many of the highest ideas of goodness in Western culture are embedded in religious language. Just as our culture's ideas of the ideal human being have been embedded to an important extent in the image of Jesus, many of our culture's ideas of the ideal society have been embedded in the image of heaven or of the holy city. D'Souza's book is at its best when it is listing the good things that may have come from Christianity: separation of church and state, limited government, the rule of law, the free market, the affirmation of ordinary life, valuing the relief of suffering, the idea of limiting war, a higher level of respect for women than among the Romans, the idea that all humans are of equal value and equal before the law, emphasis on individual freedom, and even the idea that nature can be understood because of the divine spark within us. D'Souza writes, "The life of the West," Nietzsche said, "is based on Christianity. The values of the West are based on Christianity. Some of these values seem to have taken on a life of their own, and this gives us the illusion that we can get rid of Christianity and keep the values. This," Nietzsche says, "is an illusion. Our Western values are what Nietzsche terms shadows of gods. Remove the Christian foundation and the values must go too." I agree that many of our values in our Western culture come from Christianity, not all, but many of the most important ones do. But I believe that we can honor the best of those values without thinking that God exists. The key to understanding our religious heritage and the clues it provides for the greatest things that might be possible is to realize that wonderful things are truly wonderful, whatever they are made of. There is something wonderful about a tight-knit religious community, whether it is based on a belief in God or not. A rose can be just as beautiful when one knows it is made of evolved molecular machinery. Consciousness is just as amazing, even after one realizes that it's made of the interactions of quarks, electrons, and photons. So much the better for quarks, electrons, and photons. Spiritual experiences that break down the barriers between self and nature can still be transcendent, even when we realize they involve the suppression of the part of the brain that deals with the self-other distinction. In general, information, whatever substrate it is embedded in, and however well science can explain its transmission and processing, seems to have something of the divine to it. Teleotheism is the idea that God comes at the end rather than at the beginning. If God is the greatest of all things that can come true, then we and our descendants can build God in heaven. The first step is to envision the greatest good that we can imagine. Next, we need to assemble relevant knowledge so we can build on the solid foundation of the truths about human nature and the universe. And I've got to say, a lot of people have gone wrong by trying to build a heaven based on falsehoods about human nature. You can go very, very far wrong. Finally, we have to step out into the unknown, exerting the faith to act when we know something might be possible, but don't know for sure that it is. I agree with the existentialists that having been thrown into existence by physics and evolution, we have to choose our own purpose in life. Can there be any greater purpose to life than working toward that day, that fine day when God and heaven do exist? Thank you.